Bueno amigos, hoy vamos a hablar de los zapatos romanos y particularmente de los zapatos de los legionarios, del ejército romano. Vamos a hablar de arqueología, no yo, un arqueólogo de los de verdad, de los mejores de Europa y que por supuesto está especializado entre otras cosas en el calzado romano. ¿Y por qué está especializado en el calzado romano? Pues fácil, es el director de las excavaciones de Vindolanda. Un campamento romano convertido en ciudad en el muro de Adriano, donde más zapatos han salido de todo el Mediterráneo. Nos va a contar cosas verdaderamente interesantes, no solamente de los zapatos, sino de la arqueología del zapato y del sentimiento de un arqueólogo cuando trabaja en arqueología. Es muy interesante este capítulo para los arqueólogos de verdad, los que excavan, no los que dicen que son arqueólogos y no han cavado ni un pocillo en la arena de la playa cuando eran pequeños. No. Este va a ser un programa de arqueología gracias a Andrew Birley, director de las excavaciones de Vindolanda. En España ciertamente hay una serie de cuentas en las redes que están haciendo mucho daño, porque son chicos jóvenes que saben decir dos cositas en latín y que a continuación sueltan cada disparate que cruje el cielo. Os voy a poner algunos ejemplos porque están en la red y son evidentes. Y por desgracia tienen muchísimo alcance, porque la gente por lo general no tiene criterio para estas cosas y se cree lo que le cuentan, sin ningún tipo de demostración. Y ya veis lo que divulgan, porque se autodefinen como grandes divulgadores. Científicos a veces les he oído yo decirse y todo. Pues divulgan que los legionarios iban a la guerra con eso. Y sí, no se extrañen, son los mismos que dicen que bebían de la lluvia las ciudades romanas. Esto casi nos debería de tranquilizar, porque al coincidir al menos no son muchos. Y en efecto yo en un vídeo dije, pero ¿cómo van a ir con sandalias a la guerra los legionarios romanos? Y por supuesto que me vuelvo a ratificar, porque sabía perfectamente de lo que hablaba, no es que estuviera ese día yo un poquito oído, no. Otra cosa es que me tomé mi tiempo para contestar debidamente a estas cosas. Porque esta gentecilla que ha aprendido dos frases en latín afirma que por supuesto que iban con sandalias a la guerra, que es que la han estudiado ellos. Y sí, en efecto, no me extrañaría que lo hubieran estudiado ellos. Y estos chicos que se dicen arqueólogos, aunque insisto, no se conoce una gran bibliografía arqueológica, otra cosa es la divulgativa, pues difunden estas cosas en una especie de equipo de opinión sincronizada que tiene el montado. Sí, mira, las sandalias eran así, este señor no sabe que había sandalias y que tenían tachuelas. No, me he caído de un árbol antes de ayer, vosotros que acabáis de nacer sabéis más que nadie. Por desgracia, insisto, llegan a mucha gente. Entonces es necesario rebatir estas cosas con rigor y evitar estas cadenas de bulos que nos colocan indolentemente y que muchísima gente se traga. Veréis cómo el propio Andrew Birley apuesta por combatir este tipo de informaciones, porque a él también le duele que se siga haciendo. Sin más dilación, os dejo con la entrevista con Andrew Birley, director de las excavaciones de Vindolanda. Está en inglés, pero no os asustéis, tenéis unos magníficos subtítulos en castellano grandes, fijados, para que no os podáis perder nada de la conversación. Y con la entrevista me despido hasta otra vez. Hi Andrew.
Hi Isaac.
¿Lo estás pasando bien en España?
I'm loving Spain. Fantastic. The weather, the food, the people, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Enjoy. Andrew Birley es la mejor persona a la que podemos entrevistar sobre el calzado romano, porque es la persona de todo el Mediterráneo que más zapatos romanos ha visto, pues nada menos que unos 6.000 zapatos romanos. Nadie ha visto tantos zapatos romanos, ¿verdad?, como Andrew Birley. Vamos a hacerle una entrevistilla a ver qué nos cuenta de esto.
Shoes are absolutely amazing. They tell us so much about the people who had their feet in those shoes. They tell us about social status. They tell us about fashion. They tell us about whether we've got men, women, children in certain positions and spaces. And what they've done at places like Vindolanda is completely turn on its head the idea that the military, the Roman army, was a male preserve. Because inside the barracks, and these are barracks where the Roman soldiers weren't legally allowed to marry, we have hundreds and hundreds of women and children's shoes, out of a collection of around about 6,000 shoes all told. So it's a huge amount. So being able to change the demographic of a military community to find people who would otherwise be lost completely to history is an incredible thing. It's a wonderful thing. And as archaeologists, that's one of the biggest challenges we face, is how do we tell the stories of the people who have left very little behind, who have left no trace of who they are or what they are. So history is mainly written by men, hence the word history, but the shoes give us a window into that other dynamic. Now, the preservation at the site under anaerobic oxygen-free conditions means that we have potentially 100,000 more shoes to find. We have over 50 years of excavation that's taken place, and we find these items of footwear in every archaeological deposit. So you find the children's shoes sometimes in the toilets, in the latrines, where the children have been dangling their feet down and the shoe's fallen off and it's fallen into the toilet. You find them casted away onto the floors. You find them in drains. You find them, of course, in ditches and in pits where they've been purposely buried. But Roman leather is really tough. It's really, really strong because it's tanned very thoroughly, and they use very good materials to make shoes. Because of this, it survives very, very well in those wet, oxygen-free environments. We're learning a lot about the leather itself and how these things were put together, the construction from these shoes. What sort of materials were used? Were there imports? Were there exports? Was leather made locally on the site? And one of the things that's come out very obviously is that we very rarely find pairs of shoes. So out of the 6,000 or so we have, which is a lot, I think we have something like 30 or so pairs of shoes. Well, why is this? Well, they have a very different relationship with their footwear, the Romans, to what we do today. They don't buy them in a shoe shop like we do today. They don't buy a pair of shoes that way very often. What they tend to do, if they wear a hole in one of their shoes, they replace it and they get a new shoe made exactly like the one that they've put a hole in. So you only need to buy one shoe. You don't need to buy two shoes. And so when you throw away a shoe, you're throwing away the one that's got a hole in it, it's worn. And that's what we find on the excavations most of all. Now, occasionally, because the Roman army are constantly moving, if people have been living in a space for 10 or 15 years, they get an enormous amount of things that they collect. So I would ask the audience of this video to think, how many shoes do you have at home? And if I were to ask you to walk 500 miles with only what you can carry on your back, how many of those shoes would you take with you? Well, the answer is hopefully, unless you really love your shoes, not very many. And because of that, when the Roman army have to move, they have to make some really tough decisions. And one of those is they leave thousands of shoes behind. So the popular concept, the Caligae, when you look at a reenactor, a Roman soldier, a modern Roman soldier, they're wearing sandals. And yeah, okay, the Roman army had sandals, but they also had closed boots too, very much the same sort of boots you'd find in a modern military, a modern army, because they have to walk thousands of miles through swamps, through bad weather, through dust. If they leave their feet exposed, they will get all sorts of nasty things happening to their feet. They also have softer shoes too, carbatina, which they wear inside of homes, inside of houses that have no studs at all on the bottom of them, and you wouldn't expect them to wear those shoes to war either. So there is a popular myth that the Romans are running around the countryside with open sandals, but this is an obvious weakness. It's crazy, and it doesn't reflect what we find in Northern Europe where these things are preserved. Not just at Vindolanda, but also in the Limes in the Netherlands, in Roman Scotland. We have thousands of shoes from these sites also combined, and very few of them are open sandals, or the sort of boots that you see, which you might use for parade, where you can show your nice coloured socks. That's lovely. It's great. But it's not ideal if you're running into a barbarian horde, if you've got your toes out and your socks on display. So we have to kind of fight this myth that's grown up, that's been perpetuated not just by reenactors, but also thinking about Hollywood and thinking about, the popular images you see, Asterix, Obelix, these sort of things, the popular culture, the magazines. It's fun, and it's fun to poke fun at the Romans because they look ridiculous wearing these open shoes all the time. But of course, where does this all come from? Well, a lot of it comes from monumental architecture. Trajan's column, the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, which shows some open sandals from Roman soldiers marching, but they're wearing their best, they're on parade. This is not always a true reflection of the realities of life and war 2,000 years ago. So we have to be careful to apply those images on those statues to absolutely everything that the Roman army did, because it's just simply not true. So, okay, let's talk about reenactors and moving on from that and recreations. It's very hard, isn't it? It's very hard to recreate 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Apart from anything else, we don't physically look the same. We don't have the same diet. We don't have the same exercise regime. We're not similar. If you get a lot of bankers who are dressed as Roman soldiers, they look like bankers dressed as Roman soldiers. They don't necessarily look like Roman soldiers because, you know, they're not eating 4,000 calories a day and marching 25 miles regularly. They're working in offices, and they drive cars. They're not the same physicality. We have to be careful also to reflect how people wore their clothing and styles and everything else. And footwear, of course, is an important part of this, but as is the rest of the dress. And very often we see the Roman army portrayed as a unified thing, almost like a human machine, as if they were pushed out of a factory, all looking the same, little mini versions of each other. But the more we do research into Roman military kit and gear, the more we realize that's not the case. It wasn't the case. There was a great deal of individuality to Roman soldiers. A lot of them had armor from their grandfathers. They had gear which represented the countries and the regions from which they were recruited. They would look individually different, from their hairstyles to their dress, to the facial wearings that they would have, and of course, sometimes the footwear that they would wear too. So this uniformity that you see when you look at reenactors, it's hard to take because it doesn't really reflect, it's an idealized reality rather than the reality that was probably on the ground. I respect them for doing the best they can, but let's throw a bit of mud at them, let's get them, let's look in them, you know, put them in those sort of situations which the Roman soldiers might have found themselves by having to walk through a river or a swamp, or, you know, traverse really difficult terrain, and you'd quickly see what would work and what wouldn't work 2,000 years ago. Let's talk about Spain. I mean, what an incredible and varied landscape it is. It's got lush green areas, it's got the mountains, it's also got desert areas. It's an incredibly varied landscape. And Roman soldiers would have had to reflect not just the landscape, but the seasonality too. You don't wear the same stuff in the winter that you wear in the summer. It's not reasonable to suspect that a Roman soldier will go out there and get frostbite on their toes in November, December, January, when they're walking through the mountains, because they're not wearing suitable clothing. They're not wearing heavy woolen cloaks and the right kind of leggings and gear to go with it. So this is something else we now as scholars need to consider very carefully. The yearly rhythm, not just of the military, but individuals and units, and how that cycle would affect who you are most likely to meet and how they would be dressed in that particular context. I'll give you an example. So in the summertime, you're least likely to run into a Roman soldier inside a fort in one of their bases. Why? Because they're supposed to be out on patrol. They're supposed to be on maneuver. They're supposed to be preparing for war. They're not supposed to be sitting on their bums in their barracks. You're more likely to meet non-combatants, freemen, slaves, women, children, merchants, and a few soldiers. But in the wintertime, a completely different mix. So we're just now starting to appreciate this, to understand that like we have a different cycle through the year in modern life, 2,000 years ago, it was the same for the Roman army. So when you're in the excavations and you're working away in the soil and you see the top of a shoe, it's a wonderful feeling. But an even better feeling is when you pull that out of the ground and it's resting in the palm of your hand, and you make an instant connection there that spans thousands of years. The last person to touch that have long departed, and you are holding something which is fundamental to them in your hand, and you get a sense of who that person was. Man, woman, child. If it's a child's shoe, very often it'll fit into your hand. And there is how do I say this? There is a purity to that, because the child has not had a life yet. Did they have a life? Did they continue to go on? Did they do great things? Who knows? But at that moment, they're innocent, and you have that innocence in your hands, and it's an incredible feeling. And this is why those shoes are so powerful. They're powerful when you go and visit a Holocaust museum, because they're the only things that are left from people who've been destroyed by history. But you see the shoes and you make that connection with what you're wearing on your own feet. It's the same journey in many ways that people have when they discover or interact with Roman shoes that have been survived for 2,000 years. You get that very human connection, and that's a very powerful thing. Caligula means little boots, little shoe. A Caligula is not a particular type of footwear. It's not a prescribed type of footwear. It's just a Roman reference for shoe or boot, for something that you wear on your foot. It can mean many different things. You can get a carbatina, which is a separate thing, which has no studs on the bottom and is made from one piece of leather, and that is a slipper for wearing inside your house, so that you don't take the mud from the street into your home. That's a very polite thing to do. It's almost Japanese in the sense you change your footwear before you go into, from an outside space to an inside space. You leave the mud outside and you keep everything clean inside. But a Caligula is just a shoe or a boot. It can be any different shoe or boot, lots of different designs and patterns. It isn't a prescriptive term. It's a term they use for all sorts of different footwear. And how do we know this? Because we find them. And it's not just the footwear themselves that we find. We find the ink writing tablets of Vindolanda, which actually have Caligula written on them. And what they mean there are just the boots that we're finding on the site. It's not a particular type of shoe, which there are only a few examples of. It's the massive shoes that are coming out of the earth where the soil is rich enough for them to survive. Even where the shoes themselves have disappeared, in the higher levels of the site, we find the studs, the nails from the bottom of the shoes in all sorts of places and contexts. We have no evidence at all to suggest that Roman soldiers have to particularly swap their shoes apart from going inside houses. So they're not wearing different footwear to walk across a field or a road or going up a mountain, or they don't have time to sit down and say, right, okay, everybody stop, get your spare shoes out. And how many shoes do we expect them to carry with them? If they're going out on an expedition, and this involves starting going through town, and then going on a paved road with flagstones, then a different road, and then going up a mountain, crossing a swamp, crossing a river, they're not going to have a different pair of shoes for every single situation. No, you have one pair of shoes for all those situations. This is crazy. Roman soldiers can only carry so much stuff, yeah? I mean, they have to go a long way, 20 miles, 25 miles sometimes in a day with 90 pounds. That's a lot of weight on their shoulders. You don't see wagons full of spare shoes following Roman armies in this way. So we have to use a bit of common sense here. But this is why the shoes that we're finding at places like Vindolanda or the Limes in the Netherlands are so useful, because they're multi-purpose. They're the sort of shoes that you could buy, boots in a hiking store today, and you could happily go shopping down the high street in those. Well, the Romans could do the same. And we're a little bit silly if we think they do something different, because we have no evidence to suggest from archaeology that was ever the case. Yeah, and these things are expensive, right? The nails are expensive. This isn't cheap stuff. The Roman army is spending good money. And the other thing that we forget is that each shoe is custom made for the wearer, in the same way the Pope has his shoes custom made for him. You don't buy them off a shelf. You don't say, oh, I need a size 42 or whatever. You go to the cobbler measures your foot precisely and makes a shoe that fits precisely. And we have cobblers' workshops in Roman army bases to make sure that the high quality leather is used. Multiple lines of it are used on their footwear. Sometimes 7, 8 layers of leather stitched together and then studded to give you a really soft cushion as you walk. These are expensive items. Some of the very, very expensive stuff are being shipped over from fashion houses in Europe, and they're branded. They brand the leather. Also you can look fashionable as well as being functional. But first of all, it's got to be functional. You have to be able to move around and move around quickly. And to do that, you've got to be light and you've got to be durable. And that's what Roman shoes provide. They're very, very practical. So where do we get our depictions from for shoes? Okay, well, we get them obviously from inscriptions and things like that. We get them from statues and things like this. But of course, what Hollywood does, it takes these stylized things, these displays of wealth, and it mass produces them thinking that everybody would wear such styles all the time. It forgets, of course, also about climate. It forgets about circumstances, conditions. It forgets about, fashions change through history. So certain types of boots and shoes are only available in the 1st century. They don't appear in the 2nd and the 3rd century. Styles change. Yeah? We don't see any of that from Hollywood. We just get this open sandal, sometimes with a foot, very often not without even a sock in it, which is highly impractical. And of course, then that follows on into art, literature, magazines, Asterix, great example, all this stylized sort of stuff. And it's misleading. So we have to fight and push back against that a little bit. Because the Roman army was not a machine, it wasn't a factory, everybody wasn't dressed exactly the same way. But the one thing we can guarantee is that for 99% of the time, they were dressed appropriately for the conditions in which they faced. At least they left that way. So a lot of Hollywood, a lot of this stuff that you see on TV, you've got to take with a big pinch of salt. It's designed to be cheap and quickly mass-produced, and it's almost giving us the image we expect to see, but not the image that perhaps reflects reality on the ground.